Welcome, welcome, welcome. We are on part three of a five-part video lecture series on, aggregate demand, aggregate supply, and monetary policy. So now we are on aggregate supply. We've already talked about some of the stuff on aggregate demand, but it's time to take that next step forward. So really all that we've talked about so far is aggregate demand. We talked about how we derived it both graphically and algebraically. But that's only one side of a two-sided coin because we also have to worry about aggregate supply in order to actually have an equilibrium, because you can really demand all that you want, right? You want all this cool stuff, but if there's nothing supplying it, then you're not going to get a damn thing. So let's talk about a couple of facts about aggregate supply. Well, first, aggregate supply is just what it sounds like. It's a measure of supply. And, oh yeah, surprise, surprise. It's a measure of supply at the aggregate. It's a relationship between inflation and output in our model. Now, it can also be expressed as a relationship between the price level and output. However, since this is a course on essentially monetary economics, right, we are focused more on inflation here rather than the price level. Why? Well, most central banks, and the Federal Reserve falls into that set of most central banks, care about inflation, right? So they will target inflation. They don't target the price level. So if we're looking at a macro model to be understood and to analyze US monetary policy, we kind of need to look at it from the perspective of how the central bank addresses these issues. And they don't address it through price level targeting, they address it through inflation targeting. Therefore, our little model is going to be dealing with inflation rather than price levels. There are two forms of aggregate supply that we're going to be talking about. There is a long-run aggregate supply, which is dependent purely on real factors, and there is a short-run aggregate supply, which is dependent upon both real factors and some nominal factors. And the idea here is that in the long run, aggregate supply is vertical. Why is it vertical? Well, if you're looking at it in terms of inflation and output space, aggregate supply will become vertical when it becomes independent of prices. Hence, it is determined only by real factors. So it's driven by real variables and not driven, or we can say independent of, nominal variables. This is what's known as the classical dichotomy. And the classical dichotomy essentially says that real and nominal variables can be analyzed separately, which works kind of for like long-run economic growth and development type stuff, and sort of like convergence from the short run to the long run. Like once we get to the long run, the classical dichotomy will hold. But we're going to talk a little bit later about how, sometimes it doesn't always hold in the short to medium run. Now, the real variables that we're going to be considering are things like labor supply, available capital, and technology. If it ain't one of those guys, then the long run aggregate supply isn't going to be affected by it. But in the short run, it's a very different story, because in the short run, aggregate supply is upward sloping, meaning it is affected by prices. Right? Now, this is pretty much a shape, or I should really say a slope, that you're used to seeing from principles of micro, like a nice upward sloping, almost said aggregate supply in micro, a nice upward sloping supply curve. And the idea is, in the macro context, in the short run, prices and wages are quote unquote sticky, meaning that they're slow to adjust to shocks. So think of it like this: if there's some kind of a shock, not all firms can change their prices. Consider, say, Subway, right? For the longest time, they had this like $5 footlong deal. You get a $5 footlong. But if there is some shock and, say, input prices go up a little bit, right? The cost of making these $5 footlongs goes up. They would like to just change that $5 footlong to, say, a $6 footlong. But if they do it like immediately, right, especially if this shock may not actually persist, right, it could be a transitory shock, then that could be like bad PR for them, right? It's going to piss people off to be like, what happened to that $5 footlong? They have to go, oh, well, sorry, input prices went up, which is a perfectly valid reason. Don't get me wrong. But a lot of people aren't going to buy that. They're not going to be happy with it. So they'll go, you know what, fine, we're going to eat it in the short run. In the long run, we'll be able to change our prices. But There's something keeping a firm from changing their prices in the short run, meaning that they are slow to adjust to shocks, thus prices are sticky. Obviously, in this case, the classical dichotomy breaks down because, well, we can't really just look at the way real variables change being independent of nominal variables. There's going to be some kind of like an interrelated activity thing going on here. And a big focus in macro research is the response of aggregate supply to shocks and how steep or shallow the slope of the short run aggregate supply curve is. And there's also a lot of curiosity in how long it takes to transition from the short run to the long run. Basically going from short run aggregate supply to long run aggregate supply in response to certain types of shocks. So I said we were going to do long run aggregate supply first. I kind of lied, so sue me. It doesn't really matter. You learn the stuff either way. So suppose the following is the short run aggregate supply curve. So we've got this guy right here. We've got pi equals the expectation of inflation plus gamma times y minus yp plus rho. Well, pi is inflation. E of pi is expected inflation. Gamma is how steep the aggregate supply curve is, right, related to price or wage stickiness. So the stickier prices are, the flatter aggregate supply is going to be. Y is output, YP is potential output, right? So this YP is really going to be like what the long run aggregate supply curve is when we get to the rho is an inflation shock. So rho is essentially a shock to the short run aggregate supply curve. It's 0 if there is no shock. It's larger than 0 if the shock's positive, and it's less than 0 if the shock is negative. And we'll kind of get to what some of that stuff means a little bit later on. So if you don't quite get that thing about rho, don't freak out. You'll be fine. So from this equation, if actual output is greater than potential output, then firms and households are having pressures put on them to increase prices and wages, therefore putting upward pressure on inflation. Now, if gamma is large, right, if it's a very steep short-run aggregate supply curve, it's easy to do this because prices are essentially more responsive than output is. But if gamma is small, it's a very shallow short-run aggregate supply curve, and it's not very easy to do this because prices and wages are relatively sticky. This is what it would look like if we had either a small gamma or a large gamma, right? So the large gamma, which is the guy in blue, right? That's where essentially prices and wages can respond very quickly. If gamma is small, we have a flatter short-run aggregate supply curve. Prices aren't as responsive. Output has to be more responsive. Now, what we see in black, that is sort of like prices are kind of sticky, but they're just as responsive to shocks as output is, right? So it's like a perfect 45-degree line. Anything above that, well, prices are more flexible. Anything below that, prices are less flexible. So that's kind of the relationship that we're seeing here between these three different possible slopes of the short-run aggregate supply curve. So as you can see, if this gamma, right, the pink, if that's small, we've got a flatter short-run aggregate supply, and it means that prices are sticky. Prices are thus slow to adjust, and if they won't adjust in output inflation space, then what has to happen, right? What has to respond instead? Output. So if short-run aggregate supply is flat, then output is more responsive than inflation, meaning the percent change in output is larger than the percent change in inflation. When gamma is large, it's the exact opposite of that, right? We have a much steeper short-run aggregate supply curve, meaning prices are more flexible. Prices are very fast to adjust, and thus inflation is more responsive than output is. So on to long-run aggregate supply. Where short-run aggregate supply was driven by some nominal factors, long-run aggregate supply is only determined by real factors. This means things that actually get used to produce. The things that get used to produce stuff are labor, capital, and technology. Now I'm taking a quick little aside here, but production is assumed to be governed by this function right here, y equals z times k to the beta times l to the 1 minus beta. I'd like to make a note. Typically what we see here is this z is usually an a, and beta is usually an alpha. But because both a and alpha have already been used in this model, I can't really use them again because that's going to cause all sorts of confusion. So I changed it out, but in the typical academic literature, this particular type of production function will have alphas instead of these betas and an A instead of the Z. So Y is production, right? It's output, so what's being made. Z is a source of technology shocks. Technology shocks are like if you get a cool new idea on how to make stuff, then you're like, oh, hey, cool, look, I made the jet engine, and it makes it cheaper to fly stuff around, whether it's cargo, people, etc., right? Because, well, jet engines are much more efficient than propellers. So the invention of a jet engine is going to make a lot of things cheaper and more efficient. Therefore, you can produce more stuff with fewer inputs. K is the amount of capital used in production. L is the amount of labor used in production. This beta is capital's share of income, and 1 minus beta is labor's share of income. So what does that mean? Well, it means, essentially, how much capital is contributing to income or output, right? Because output and income are going to be the same thing. Beta is telling me how productive capital is and how much capital is contributing to what that income is and how much labor is contributing to what that income is via 1 minus beta. Now, like I said, some of the letters used in this notation aren't typically used in standard practice. I just wanted to make that clear to alleviate any possible sources of confusion. So these exponents are exogenous and they're fixed parameters, meaning they're determined from outside the system and they're constant. Oh, and it says alpha here. I thought I had changed all the alphas to betas. Oops. Beta tells us how much of output is determined by capital's contribution. Right? So if it goes up, it means capital contributes a lot to output. Therefore, more of total output's income goes to capital. It means labor's share shrinks, and thus the amount of income that goes to labor gets smaller, and the amount of income to capital gets bigger. The variables K and L are endogenous, meaning they're determined from within the system. The more households save, the more capital is available for production. We'll get into that later. The variable Z governs how technology shocks affect the system. If Z is equal to 1, there's no technology shock, right? Everything's just plugging along as normal. If Z is larger than 1, there are positive technology shocks, and if Z is less than 1, well, surprise, surprise, there are negative technology shocks. If anyone gets a cool idea for how to produce things cheaper and more efficiently, then Z is going to be larger than 1. It's a positive technology shock. If for some reason people somehow forget technology, Z is less than 1. It's a little weird to think about it that way, but unfortunately, that's just kind of the best way that it can be analyzed. Okay, so whatever. Back to short run, long run aggregate supply. From what we learned, if gamma approaches infinity, there's no difference between short run and long run aggregate supply because it's a vertical supply curve. Both aggregate supply curves cross the point y equals yp, and at the inflation rate of inflation plus rho. But if rho is generally assumed to be 0, then on average, there's no inflation shock, and inflation equals expected inflation. Households and firms aren't surprised by inflation, and this output equals potential output, regardless of what gamma is. Right? That's at that point where they cross. Nominal rigidities really only matter if agents are tricked. Right? If you think that you know what inflation is going to be. Say you think it's going to be 2%, and then, the monetary authority comes along and they're like, ha, bamboozled again. And they hit you with like 5% inflation, right? Then that nominal rigidity is going to matter because you got tricked. You weren't expecting a higher rate of inflation. But we're going to get a little bit more into that later on in the course where we can get into it like at a very, very deep level. Now, the short run aggregate supply curve will shift to the left if expected inflation or rho were to increase. The increase in expected inflation is endogenous, meaning it happens from within the model. The increase in rho is exogenous, meaning it happens from outside the model. Right? So, we have a shift of aggregate supply from an increase in expected inflation. This is what we get, right? So the aggregate supply curve is shifting up, meaning that for any particular level of production, prices are now higher. Not very good, is it? Nope, not at all. Now here is a shift of aggregate supply from an increase in rho, right? Again, it just shifts up. Say it shifts to the left, it shifts in, shifts up in this case, right? Because for, like I said, any level of production, goods and services become more expensive. The shifts in the short run aggregate supply curve resulting from increases in either of these variables have similar effects on short run aggregate supply, but the causes of the shocks are different. Right? A shock to expected inflation is a shock to expected inflation. Right? Agents' expectations of inflation have been revised upward. So in this case, people are expecting inflation to increase, but if you recall, an upward move in supply means that holding the output level fixed, prices go up. You pay more for the same amount of stuff. A shock to row is an inflation shock. An inflation shock is something like a cost push shock, right? Oil price shocks could be an example. It costs more to produce stuff, so output prices go up. So you can see the causes and the interpretations of these shocks are two totally different things, even though they kind of look the same on the graph. Now, when it comes to other types of inflation shocks, think about it on your own. What else could cause a cost push shock? So we've seen that with an increase in expected inflation or in row, we have an increase in prices for the same level of output. But potential output stays the same. Why is that? Well, it's because potential output is unaffected by nominal shocks. It's only affected by real shocks. If there's an increase in some kind of real factor of production, you've got more capital, more labor, or there are technology shocks, then we can shift potential output to the right. Now, while a rightward shift of short-run aggregate supply will increase prices and hold output constant, a right shift, there's supposed to be a left shift of short-run aggregate supply, not right, sorry. A rightward shift of potential output will increase prices, holding output constant. Sorry about that little mix-up there. It's supposed to be left shift of short-run aggregate supply. Technology shocks tend to have the largest impact on shifts to potential output, and we can go through that again later in the course. This is what we get here, right? So when this happens, output increases, and if we hold the inflation rate constant, yeah, you see output increases. However, when we get to this thing with demand, right, where we intersect this with aggregate demand, we'll see that the prices are actually falling, which is kind of cool. Note that both the short run and long run aggregate supply curves shift when there's an increase in potential output. This is because short run aggregate supply is responsive to short run nominal shocks and rigidities. However, it's determined by the long run, or in the long run, by the position of long run aggregate supply, which is driven by real factors. So if there's a shift to long run aggregate supply, then short run aggregate supply shifts by the exact same amount. In other words, the point where short run and long run aggregate supply curves intersect shifts to the right, but it doesn't move up or down. So to summarize long run and short run aggregate supply, both of them are determined by real factors, but short run aggregate supply can be affected by nominal factors like monetary policy shocks, fiscal shocks, other types of aggregate demand shocks. Now, with all of that out of the way, instead of out of the way, it's time to talk about something else with these two guys, and it's called the output gap. This is the difference between what potential GDP and actual GDP is. If potential output is larger than actual output, then the output gap is negative, meaning we're producing below our potential, and short-run aggregate supply is to the left of long-run aggregate supply. Essentially means we're not producing as much as we could be. The flip side holds. If actual output is larger than potential output, the output gap is positive, and short-run aggregate supply is to the right of long-run aggregate supply. This means we're producing beyond our potential output. Now, if the two are equal, the output gap is zero, and we're producing right where we need to be. Here are illustrations of a positive and a negative output gap. What you see in pink is the negative output gap. At that point of short-run aggregate supply, right, it is less than long-run aggregate supply. Positive output gap, well, it's above. When we discuss monetary policy in the model, we're going to talk about how the Monetary Authority, the Federal Reserve in the U.S., uses policy to try to effectively close the output gap or to minimize it. If output is above its potential, the economy is overheating. Output reaching its maximum capacity utilization isn't a particularly good thing. We can't really produce a lot more, right? But if we're demanding a lot more, then inflation goes up, right? If people demand more than what can actually be made by the economy, inflation eventually has to go up. It doesn't matter how sticky prices are. There is a point where we just can't produce more stuff. Now, in that case, what would happen is the Federal Reserve would raise interest rates, or what's known as contractionary monetary policy, to reduce output and close the output gap to make sure output is closer to potential and therefore reduces the inflation rate. Now, if output is below potential, the economy is underproducing. That's not good either. Output is below potential. Inflation is below the target rate of inflation. We could be producing a lot more than we currently are. So in this case, the Fed would cut rates to try to stimulate borrowing and lead to economic growth. Now, in the next lecture, we're going to be talking about general equilibrium. This is where aggregate demand equals short-run aggregate supply equals long-run aggregate supply. We're going to talk about shocks to the system in the lecture following that, like what causes the shocks, how the shocks propagate, and how the economy responds to these shocks and returns to its steady states. After that, we'll close out and move on to other topics. So, with all of that lovely stuff out of the way, we will wrap up this lecture and we will move on to the next one. Keep an eye out. It should be coming along shortly. Thank you for watching this, and I guess I won't see you next time, but you'll see this, you'll hear me next time. So, thanks for watching and hear me next time.